Hey, Emily,
Hey, Stephanie.
you want to do a podcast?
Absolutely.
Welcome to Cycle Chats, a podcast to destigmatize what it means to be a woman. It's Transgender Awareness Week, which means we have a very special guest with us today. We are speaking with queer Alaskan activist, artist, and co-founder of Oh, you know what? Let me stop for a second because I realized that was a question I had. How do you pronounce that? Is it Talkeetna or am I completely butchering it?
I think you're adding syllables. It's Talkeetna, but Talkeetna, it sounds beautiful. I'd love to visit.
Me too. Apparently, I'm the president. Welcome. All right. Say it one more time for me because I'm going to do it.
You're totally fine. Talkeetna.
You got this.
Yeah, I have it written out how I would say it.
I like it. I may leave that in. Who knows? We'll see.
Welcome to Cycle Chats, a podcast to destigmatize what it means to be a woman. It's Transgender Awareness Week, which means we have a very special guest with us today. We are speaking with queer Alaskan activist, artist, and co-founder of Talkeetna Pride, a center for LGBTQ plus resources and advocacy within the queer community. The ever so fierce and fabulous Lillian Lennon. I did it. Third time's, fourth time's, fifth time's a charm. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of that very, very long but well-deserved opening.
Of course. I'm happy to be here.
We can't thank you enough. This is very educational, not only for our listeners, hopefully, but also for Steph and I. So thank you for being here, being present, and wanting to talk with us, because this is something that needs to be heard. People need to be educated about it. So we're really, really looking forward to our conversation. So my first question for you is, what was it like growing up for you? And you can take that in any way. You can start at the beginning, the middle, whatever you want.
Sure. Well, I grew up in between Anchorage and Talkeetna, Alaska, and around the age of 14, actually, I, came out as a trans woman. I wasn't initially accepted. I had virtually no support. And unfortunately, this is a super common reality for young queer kids. And, just trying to explore myself and experiment with my identity, I was sent away, across the United States to Utah for about 2 years to a residential treatment facility where they practice conversion therapy. And, of course, that's not an extremely typical experience for young queer folks, but it's far more typical than any of us should be comfortable with.
Yeah, that was actually something I was just watching a couple videos on last night, and I don't even understand where they would think that's something that could actually help and what it is that you're trying to help. So I'm so sorry that you went through that, but do you feel that those experiences formed your voice as an activist?
Well, I think that's exactly it. I was a very different person in middle school and early high school. I didn't really have a voice, was really uncomfortable being open and vulnerable and, part of a community. I didn't really have one. So coming out, like I said, I didn't have support or really any models to base, myself on to, support me. And, I think that, I was forced, into a situation where I was very vulnerable, placed in a boys' dorm, identifying, of course, as a queer trans woman. So even that in and of itself was a really difficult thing. But then having to undergo isolation, conversion efforts while in therapy, and everything like that, I was really forced to fight back for myself. And realizing that so many young queer kids have to deal with this, I felt it necessary to not only use my voice to speak up for myself, but lift up and empower others going through similar circumstances or simply trying to exist as a queer person, because it's hard existing as a queer person. And sometimes you need those people who are outspoken, and I felt drawn into that role.
That's beautiful. I love that. I mean, so my brother is gay, and I remember when he told me, he was so scared of how I would react. And after he told me, I remember we were sitting on the bottom bunk of my bed, and I just looked at him. I was like, did you really think I wasn't gonna love you the same? And he just started crying because he was just so concerned. And then about, I don't know, probably 8 years later, my cousin started transitioning, and I remember he wasn't being very upfront with the family when it was happening. It was more, he was going going on his own journey, which was totally fine. But, you know, all of the older members of my family, I know were like, what's going on? What's happening? My brother and I were a bit more in tune and we're like, we think we understand. And, you know, it's a beautiful thing to be able to stand up and be who you are, to be unapologetically yourself and know that you're not alone, because Stephanie and I were definitely the outcasts as well in school. We did drama, we were weird, we were nerdy, but at the end of the day, I think what makes us stronger people, humans, and it just grows our heart so that we can love, have empathy and sympathy for all of those people around us. So no matter what you went through, it made you who you are today. So we're happy that you're here and standing up for the little people, if you will.
Thank you. Yeah, it really does take more people being actual allies and understanding these struggles if we're going to get to a place where we don't have fear coming out. You know, you mentioned your brother, and no matter how close you were, it's hard to be that vulnerable, knowing that it's a very real risk that you'll be outright rejected, even by someone you love. So until we get to that point, it's going to be hard no matter what. But until we get to that point, it's near impossible to exist equally as a queer person.
You mentioned something about ally, and I was actually stalking your Instagram a little bit, and I noticed that you posted a little black square. Well, what are you actually doing to help? And I think that's very interesting because the dawn of social media can be both beautiful and ugly, but I think for the good parts of it, we bring awareness to things, but it can't just be the visual part of it. So as an ally, what can people do to contribute to not just the social media aspect of it, but the behind the scenes? What can somebody do to really embody the word ally?
You know, I think that it's the same across the board, whether you're talking about being an ally to the queer community, to the Black community, to people of color, what have you. It's not enough to just say that you're not queerphobic or you're not racist. You need to actually be anti-racist and anti-queerphobic. You have to work every day to hold yourself and other people accountable to that same basic necessity of being anti-hatred. And so many people don't hold themselves to that standard. Instead, they just claim, I'm not racist, I'm not queerphobic, I'm not homophobic, I'm not anti-Semitic. But, you know, where's the actual work? It's not enough to just claim that. So I would say that for sure. And it goes the same for people within the queer community. Some of our worst allies, unfortunately, are within the queer community. People that come to mind, I don't know why, but RuPaul and many lesbian and gay and bisexual people who think, well, the fight for marriage equality is done. We have that in the United States. What's the point of working for more progress? And I'm not necessarily saying that that's everyone, but enough of our own community has abandoned everything after the LGB. And we need more allies within our own community. It's sad to say, but it's true.
Well, speaking of RuPaul, I often find that anytime they had trans folk on the show, it was a publicity stunt. And I already see how this new I'm assuming you don't really follow it much. And I see little bits and pieces.
The Drag Race, is that right?
Drag Race, RuPaul's Drag Race. Have you watched this current season or no?
I've watched a little bit of previous seasons just because, you know, drag it's a queer thing. It's part of queer culture.
Yeah.
I can't stand RuPaul. I can't stand the Drag Race. I don't watch it anymore, but not without reason. So,
well, no, and that kind of goes to my point of I started noticing a theme that when they would be called out on maybe something they weren't very inclusive of, it seemed like they would push harder for the other side of it to be like, look at how inclusive we are. I think that's also a very damaging, I guess, push.
Well, it's tokenizing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not like people just want to be accepted for who they are, for their truth, for how they live. We don't need to we talk a lot about on this podcast, putting people on pedestals, I think can be very damaging, good or bad. So toxic positivity and then just toxic negativity. And there's that intense divide. We're just trying to have inclusion and we're all trying to live in the same space without this, like, I guess, this pedestal parade. Because now what we're doing is we're saying, oh, well, look, now we're giving all of this. Look at how good and how inclusive we are. And look at us and pat us on the back. I think that's also can be very negative because now people are thinking, well, if I don't, that social media thing, right? If I'm not supporting it, visually, then I'm not supporting it. But I know a lot of people who are supporting it visually, but are doing a ton of work behind the scenes. We have a friend who, during the Black Lives Matter movement, she was heavy pushing for it, but she was also doing the legwork. She was out there. She was going to the marches. She was talking about it, and she was taking the time to educate people to say, look, we're not asking you to put this on a pedestal and all of a sudden, fan us and feed us grapes. We're asking you to just treat us as it's basic human decency, basic human rights. So yeah, I think there certainly is a bit of a, the words are eluding me, but there's this sense of like, oh, but look at me and look at how, pat me on the back. Look at how good I'm doing.
Well, there's a disconnect. Yeah.
Thank you. Disconnect. I was trying, it was on the tip of my tongue. So it's,
well, I was just going to go and speak to the thing, what you were saying, Lillian, about education, and Stephanie, you were talking about it too, right? It's this idea that like we put it on social media. We're so educated. Black Lives Matter. But what are you doing behind the scenes? Are you educating yourself? Are you watching TV that matter? Like all of these things. Are you opening a friggin' book? Are you talking to somebody that maybe you have never spoken to before? Like without anything else, if we just think about being humans, because that's what we all are, right? We're human beings. If we just kind of erase everything else, communication is huge. There is such a huge divide, not only in this country, but yes, hugely in this country, but in all over the world, where people just aren't communicating anymore. They're not speaking to one another. So the disconnect comes largely from that. It becomes from fear of communicating with the other, if you will. So it's just education, communication, all of those things. We need to find our way back to them, because it's just that people aren't being educated. They aren't communicating. So it's just this facade of I'm woke or whatever you want to say. But at the end of the day, you haven't put in, as you said, the legwork to being the best ally, to being supporting your friends that are in that LGBTQA plus family, to your family. Like I literally have these people in my family, and I need them to know, and I hope that they know that I am here. I'm going to love them regardless, because I do. My heart is so full. I may not understand everything, but I want you to educate me further. I don't want you to be scared of education, because I just think it's unfortunately like the biggest part is just the education is missing. It's just missing.
Right. And that's part of why we need help from allies, because it really shouldn't be on the backs of every one of us queer people to educate the non-queer people. So, having those resources available and having people who can help speak up with us so that we're not constantly re-explaining ourselves, that takes a big toll, having to educate each and every person that we encounter on why we exist and who we are. And also on the systems that continue to perpetuate a status quo, because it's not just our communities and our society. We need our system to change in order to support a more equitable future. And we're not going to achieve that with, just people posting on social media. We need people to be out there and working and talking, and we need the systems to start following suit.
And shifting and changing. And it seems like you're doing a little bit of that. More than just a little, with your co-founder of Talkeetna Pride. I see it's a center for LGBTQ plus resources. What exactly do you do within this community to assist queer folk?
Yeah, so I, of course, have to be honest. The pandemic has made it really hard to continue operations for Talkeetna Pride, because our biggest thing really was Pride Week, our festivals and everything like that, and bringing people from all over the state in order to celebrate in a small rural community. But with the pandemic, that's not possible. We can't bring people from all over the state into this small little space and potentially hurt our community. But, aside from that, we really try to, first and foremost, educate, because it is small and libertarian and some parts, conservative, and the Valley area of Alaska is particularly conservative. So we're trying to expand to better educate and support places where some of our queer people might feel the most vulnerable. Definitely feel the most vulnerable. I, of course, work with other organizations like Choosing Our Roots, which works to house queer and homeless youth. Trans Leadership Alaska, which is a statewide trans-led advocacy organization. And I also work for the municipal government currently here in Anchorage.
Wow, you have your foot in every door. That makes me so happy because the future is brighter with you and your pink hair. I love everything you said, and you brought something up which therefore sparked a memory. We spoke to this absolutely lovely Black therapist last weekend, and Stephanie brought up the idea of This Is Us and Randall going to see a white therapist, and in the end saying, hey, I actually don't think you could help me because you don't understand.
In terms of also too, to piggyback off that, like even what you were saying, I'm tired of having to explain something that you should already understand, right? Like I don't want to have to go through this whole thing, which is why I think we all have our positions and where we are. Some people are in the front lines, some people are in the middle saying, hey, listen, don't bother them. They're fighting the good fight right now. How can I help you? How can I educate you? Because I've not had to really go through it, but I know enough about it to educate you. They're tired. They're fighting the fight, doing something even more intense right now. They don't have time to unpack it.
No, that's exactly where I was going for. So it sparked my memory to think of that, because every person you meet, you can't go and like, hey, this is that. That is exhausting.
Right. Like imagine if I had to explain myself to every stranger that ever stared at me. I just stare back, quite honestly.
Oh my, well, I mean, that's the best way to do it, quite honestly. At that point, you just wear a friggin' sandwich board and be like, I'm different. Stop staring, because it's just friggin' annoying. So something else that I know that you've done from also stalking your Instagram, I know that you're big into the bathroom bill. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's really super important.
Yeah, of course. So this was in 2018 and parts of 2017. I had just gotten out of high school, came to Anchorage, where I was born, and found myself in a community where some of our most, hateful people were proposing an anti-trans, essentially, bathroom bill. I mean, it was public facilities, but it essentially extended into legalizing discrimination and promoting hate. We've seen it in other states where as soon as something like this comes to the ballot or comes to, local government, we start seeing people trying to uphold this and actually promoting hate, going after trans people. I found myself compelled to do something about it. This was a deeply personal issue. It still is. Many states are currently undergoing some form of attack on trans people. And, I got involved out of high school. I became one of the lead organizers of Fair Anchorage, which was a coalition of many organizations across the state and the nation to defeat Proposition 1, the anti-trans bathroom ordinance. And we were able to defeat it. It was by a slim margin, but it shows a lot of progress from previous years because it's not like we haven't faced something like this before. I think one of the main takeaways that I personally took out of it was how we kind of changed the game when it came to this sort of advocacy for and by trans people. Previously, many of the campaigns against these sorts of bills and ordinances had made an intentional effort to not involve trans people, either in leadership, in messaging, or in representation, because it's just too taboo a topic, they thought, for many people. And of course, this is incredibly offensive and not effective, because we're not centering trans people on an issue about trans people, nothing about us without us. And we were able to change that. I became involved. We had several trans people on a committee that had previously been all cisgender. And we're featuring messaging that centered trans people. And that's extremely different from what we've seen before. I'd say that it wasn't perfect. We centered binary trans people, but there was a huge gap when it came to gender expansive people who didn't fit the binary, which is unfortunate. But I hope that we can keep this model progressing going forward and continue centering the people who really matter when it comes to this fight.
Yeah, that actually brings me to a question, which I'm hoping is something that let me know if you're uncomfortable answering it. Totally cool. Something I've always fought against when I was very young, I had discovered what being transgender was. And I was like, whoa, I didn't know this existed. So the more it opened my eyes, the more I felt the need to speak up to people who didn't understand it, right? And then as I progressed into this, I thought to myself, well, gender identity and sexuality, I feel, difference of opinion, are two separate things. So in your opinion, those two things, do they coexist or can they live separately of one another?
I think in every circumstance, gender identity and sexual orientation are separate. They're entirely separate identities. And just because you're one thing doesn't mean that you have to be another. However, being a part of the, gender diverse or sexually diverse community means you're a part of the queer community. We lumped those together because they're a part of that same community. So yes, they're different, but a part of the queer community as a whole.
Do you feel that there's a negative stereotype that can be, or I wouldn't say negative, just a stereotype that can be very damaging when you're trying to educate about being queer?
I think that, since we're talking about the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, one thing that comes to mind is something I very often hear. When people talk about us, they say, the gay community. The gay community meaning either the gay community or the LGBTQ plus community or trans people or what have you. I think that's definitely an issue perpetuated, by the gay community itself that has dominated the space. I mean, they deserve space. They absolutely do. They're still an oppressed community, but it doesn't make any room for the rest of us. And of course, sexual orientation and gender identity are very different. So it doesn't even make sense logically why we would refer to it that way. And it's damaging because we start neglecting, every community after the LGB. And I'm trying to hammer on this more because people continue to ignore it and be ignorant about it. I can't tell you, exactly how often, I hear this or someone communicates to me that they're for the gay community and not necessarily everything else that's a part of the queer community itself. So I suppose that's just one, but I think it's important that we recognize how diverse we actually are and that it was trans women of color that really started this queer revolution. And it was kind of gay people that swept in and stole that from the rest of us. So I don't know. I think that's worth mentioning.
Oh, I'm so glad that you said that because I think people need to start doing research. Again, we can go back to RuPaul. I think we use that nowadays. You see the younger generation kind of idolizes that as some sort of mold breaker. But look a little deeper, dig a little bit deeper. The Stonewall riots. I mean, this stuff, you have to educate yourself on what came before all of that and what laid out the foundation. I'm not doing it any justice, but I'm going to put all the applicable links below. But there was a couple, I cannot remember because this is newer information to me, that owned an adult entertainment store. But what they did for the queer community, they were advocating for acceptance when things were not looking so hot. And it was a very interesting story because there's such a small piece of that puzzle, but because nobody, we all look at the kind of the figureheads, so to speak, the social media overly inherently present social media figures as these big movers and shakers, but there are people underneath quietly that helped revolutionize safety for the queer community. So I think education is really important, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I encourage people to do research about who was out in the streets, who was fighting the good fight to be heard, to be seen, to be accepted, because you'd be very, very surprised that what we're being fed now and what actually was are two very different narratives. So education is very key. We talk about it all the time. And I mean, it's fascinating to go back and to see how much of an impact that made. I guess, which brings me to my next point. What led you, in a snapshot, your journey into becoming this extremely well-rounded, high-credentialed activist? I mean, your list is lengthy.
Like I touched on earlier, I think that it really did start when I had to fend for myself and for other queer folks in the same situation when I was in Utah. I was forced into a position where I needed to fight for myself. And that made me realize the outstanding need that was to be had in the queer community and every intersectionality off of that. Getting back to Alaska, I had a tough time. It took me a while to develop an actual community. It's very small and quaint in Talkeetna, but I was able to create something of that for myself and others who belonged to the same community by founding Talkeetna Pride. And that was a big reason that I did, because I felt a gap, and a lot of us did. And then, of course, getting back to Anchorage, where I now live and work, I had a lot of great support from, role models of mine that lifted me up and empowered me into the position I am today. Without my community and without the support of so many, I certainly wouldn't find myself here today. So I definitely need to recognize that and acknowledge that. We can't just stop at our own community. We can't just stop at ourselves. We need to be lifting each other up and empowering each other. That's the only way that we can help build leaders and a better future.
I love that you said that. That's something that we talk about a lot. The idea of lifting one another up, supporting one another. Nothing's going to happen to you if you do it. You're just lifting one another up. That's it. It's not like you're going to be like slapped on the hand. It's just a good thing. It's just being a decent human, supporting people that are doing good work, being the change that we need to see and perpetuate in this country and all over the world. There's so much hate, and love is so much easier. I think just love, show support, open your heart. If somebody's doing something good, you don't know what that person's going through. So if you can get out of your own way and send them a message and just say, hey, I see you, I love what you're doing, that's all that it takes. And it goes back to what I was saying before about communication is just unfortunately falling apart. People aren't willing to communicate. People can't even hold conversations anymore. And eye contact, forget about it. You can't look somebody in the eye anymore. They have no idea what that means. So we need to find a way back. And we said this in the last recording, but to put the social back in social media, because that's what it should be. It should be about connecting. It shouldn't be about likes or about looking your best, presenting one side of the coin. No, 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 no. There is so much more. And too much of this world is built around hate. But I wonder if we change that to love and how much the world would kind of blossom and open up. It's huge, which leads me to my next question of what does women empowerment and equality mean to you? Because I'm sure you have an amazing answer and I can't wait to hear.
Well, I hope I do. Before I answer, though, I might want to say that I think that the reason we have so many hateful people and that is so hard is because hating is so easy. And I hate to contradict, but hating really is easy. It's the easy way out, just not caring or hating. Absolutely reaching out to someone, checking in on them is super easy as well. And we should do more of that, but we don't put in the care and we don't put in the effort. That's why we have so much hate and we don't see so many people supporting one another. Whereas love can be really difficult at times. It's hard. It's hard to love someone all the time with all the ups and downs of life. And it's loss and hurt. And all of this comes with love as well. And that's really difficult. And we have to deal with that a lot in life. And far more often when it comes to loving people who are marginalized and oppressed, it's difficult. But to go back to your previous question, do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, no, of course. And I love what you said. I can't ever see hate. I just love. So for me, hating is really difficult because I just want to love everybody.
But you know what? I have a theory because I happen to agree with both of you. I think loving is easy for somebody who's willing to admit their way of thought might not be so good, or willing to admit that they were wrong about something. I think hating is easy because it doesn't take very much effort, because you can say, well, you're wrong, I'm right, that's it. I can hate you because this is what I believe and I'm sticking up for myself. Whereas love actually takes effort to say, well, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong. And maybe I should see the other side of the coin. So I do think there's, for somebody who maybe is a little bit more, as Emily so eloquently put it, woke, it's a little bit, I guess, easier to tap into that empathy, that sympathy. But hate naturally seems to be what we go to, right? We say when we're upset, anger instead of compassion. It takes a lot of practice. And as we always say about love and relationships, it takes work. Love is not just something that naturally comes, obviously, when we're younger, but now you put the stressors of life, you put lack of support, you put whatever it may be, love starts to become a little bit more difficult to say, oh God, but it's a practice that we put into play. And the more you practice loving yourself, loving your imperfections, the more you can love others. I think it all goes back to education, is just educating people to say, I always say when someone gets upset, who hurt you? What's going on? There's something deeper there. I think there's a little 50-50 on both of it. I certainly do think that there's something to be said about both schools of thought.
I think it's easier if you're well practiced, for sure. If this is something that you practice every day, it's definitely easier, but it takes maintenance, constant maintenance, just like relationships, in order to sustain them and to feel content and happy. Whereas I think that, even for the both of you, even for me, it would be easier just to say, screw it, I hate this. I certainly feel called to that often. I don't like it, but that anger at people for not doing enough, for not changing our systems, for continuing to perpetuate inequality and oppression, it makes me terribly angry. And I'd say it's easy to do that, but it's hard to either use that anger to change those systems, make progress, or to return with love. I think either are valid. I don't think we should shame either of them.
So my question before was, because we went on a beautiful tangent. Like we said, the train sometimes goes off, and that's okay. We're all safe. We wore our seatbelts. So what does women empowerment and equality mean to you?
For me, women empowerment means bringing up the status quo, the base minimum, but also more than that. It's so hard to exist as, a woman, a queer woman, as a gender queer person, gender nonconforming person in a world led by cis hetero white men. And things are changing, but unbearably slowly. It's hard because, I want my statements to mean more than just I hope for women empowerment and I hope for progress in the future. But like I said, it's unbearably slow. And I think that it means that regardless of who you are, you should be guaranteed that basic equality at the least. It means more than just women, but, oppressed and marginalized gender variant people. And I think we need to do more to recognize that historically, gender queer people and, women in general have been in a generally similar boat.
What you were saying is truthful, Lillian, and Steph and I, we have said this a few times too. We are so much more alike than we are different. And we have to celebrate those similarities and the differences because those are what makes us all unique individuals. But realizing that at the base, that we all bleed the same friggin' color blood. Like, that's it. We're all made up of atoms. We're all human. Like, that has to be the base. We have to understand that similarity because it's huge. We are all human beings. The differences are what makes life interesting to live.
Right. That's extremely true. I think that, the similarities are as valid as the differences. It's important that we do make a conscious effort to acknowledge and celebrate our differences as well, like you said, just because so many of these communities are still oppressed. And without that recognition, we're not going to be making any relevant effort in order to achieve equality. Acceptance is very valid and we need to strive for that, but we don't need to make everything the same. We need to celebrate our differences. We don't need color blindness or blindness towards our, gender diverse and sexually diverse people. That's counterintuitive. And yeah, we need to celebrate both sides of the coin, differences and similarities.
And I think that is so very true, that celebrating those differences and understanding where they come from really are the key to being able to say, okay, hey, we realize maybe some things are askew here, right? And I understand kind of snowballing off of that feeling of like, why isn't this changing quick enough? Why don't people understand this? I don't get it.
But it's so much bigger than that, though, because people are dying. And for so long, we express frustration like, why is this taking so long, as though we're waiting in line or waiting on the tarmac of an airport. But the reality is we're not just waiting idly by. People are dying and suffering because of our inability or resistance to change. People are going houseless. People are going hungry. People are being killed. And we need to get really serious really quick, or this is going to just escalate until there's an ultimate breaking point.
Yes to everything. Yes, yes, yes. Big, bold italics, 100 million points in the sky. So I don't want to take up all your time. So we have 2 more questions. I want to know, what advice would you give your 15-year-old self?
I think that's really complicated, but I would say fight like hell. I wish I had fought more. I had to develop my bravery and my vulnerability and sense of self, but, fight like hell, because there's no guarantee that things will get better. Sometimes it really does take all your will in order to, achieve that sense of safety and equality and justice. I, only wish I did more of that for myself and for others while I was in a particularly dangerous situation, away from everything I knew across the United States.
I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you for taking time to share your story. I hope that whomever listens to this, if it affects somebody to reach out to say, oh wow, somebody gets my story, for you to create a safe space for them to come to you. I wish for that with this episode, which brings me to something I always ask, but I think it's very important, especially now. Where can people find you? What projects do you have coming up? And what are some queer communities that us cis folk can support, can stand behind, and can research to further help expedite this process and create a safe space for all?
Of course, anyone who wants to get in touch with me can find me on social media, of course, at Miss Lillian Lennon, which is MSLILLIANLENNON. And my email is the same, just at gmail.com. And as far as organizations or communities to support in this time, I would say that it's really important for all of us to do our own research because we all care about different things. Different things have different significance and importance to us. And also there are so many organizations out there doing the important work and so many that aren't. But, do your research, find causes that resonate with you and also might not directly affect you because we can't just look out for ourselves. We need to be looking out for each other and supporting one another and empowering each other.
Thank you. This was everything we wanted it to be and more. This was so important for both Stephanie and I to put out there. We know that not everybody is going to agree with this and that we'll lose listeners and followers and whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, we don't care and we don't want them here because love is for everyone. Everyone deserves love and everyone deserves equality.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me. And on your point of if you don't like this, well, I'm flipping you off from behind my microphone. I don't care.
Amen. I love that. No, because that's the truth. And you even said you built your own courage. I mean, that gives me goosebumps because you fought like hell and you're here. And we're talking to you and we have the privilege of being able to hear your story. And when we get off of this podcast, it doesn't just stop here. It gives Emily and I food for thought. Every person we have that comes here, we talk to each other after and we say, how can we share their story? But more importantly, is there something they feel passionate about that we can support, that we can stand behind, that we can do the work and get our hands dirty, so to speak? Because that is just, it's basic human decency. And whatever we can to support and to fight alongside and to be real true allies in this thing, I'm all for it. And time is very precious. So we want to thank you beyond a ton for sharing your time with us. It really means a lot and we just appreciate it abundantly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it abundantly too and beyond a ton. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lillian, for your time. Thank you, listeners. And we hope you sync up with us next time.